Labor Day weekend? Ah.
Yeah, I don't know.
One of the people I talked to said that they thought that we're not meeting Labor Day weekend. I cannot come Saturday. I'm doing a yoga thing, Bhagavad Gita.
So for some reason, we're getting, we're recording the recording, which makes no sense to me.
Uh-oh.
So. All right. Good. All right, I ended the live stream and I'm recording this just to my computer, so it's being saved, but hopefully we won't have the same echo problem. Anyway, that's a whole lot of, that's technology. It's supposed to make life easier. All right, Flann O'Brien, we've had an introduction to Flann O'Brien from Jack Walsh and from Flann's grandson, or grandnephew, I should say, great nephew, Oisin. And I'm sorry that neither of them are here, but they're in the south of France somewhere having fun, which is good. So we're going to read The Poor Mouth, which was published originally in Irish in 1941 as An Béal Mhacht. Béal is mouth, Mhacht is adjective in Irish. It's actually bocht, but since it's modifying a noun, it's lenited, which means the H is added to the B, and it's pronounced Vocht instead of bocht. So it has to do with Irish grammar, which is fascinating, and I could spend a couple hours talking about that, but we're not going to do that. Anyway, An Béal Mhacht, The Poor Mouth, a bad story about the hard life. And it's a satire, it's a parody of a whole group of novels that had been written and published in Irish starting after independence in 1921, after the, when Ireland was not a republic yet, but there was a measure of self-rule. And a number of books were published largely with the idea of recording some of the old culture that was disappearing as time went on. Books like this, Peg, and this one in particular, The Island Men by Tomás Crowan. An Toillinach in Irish was its original title, An Toillinach, The Island Men. And that was published originally in 1929. And most of those books, if not all of them, were required reading in the school system in Ireland from 21 until Flann was writing in 41, and long after that, I think up at least until the 60s and 70s, and they might still be being taught today. So a whole generation of people grew up reading these stories, these autobiographies of people from the Gaeltachts, from the Irish-speaking areas, about life in mid to late 19th century Ireland and early 20th century Ireland. Peg is not particularly well written or that interesting, but The Island Men is extremely fascinating. And Flann O'Brien himself was a good friend of Tomás Crowan and admired his writing, but also saw some humor in the whole situation. And we'll see as we read the Poor Mouth, if you ever read The Islandman, which is worth reading, you'll understand exactly where Flann O'Brien was coming from. And just for an example, here's just a paragraph at the very end of The Islandman. He says, I have written minutely of much that we did, for it was my wish that somewhere there should be a memorial of it all. And I have done my best to set down the character of the people about me, so that some record of us might live after us. For the like of us will never be again. Mm. And numerous times in the book, he'll be talking about some character or other, and he will say, and the like of him will not be seen again. You know, yeah. it's a stock phrase in Irish. He also does this thing where, I can show you maybe. He begins the chapters with brief headings. Mm-hmm. So the title is My Childhood, and then all of the subheadings read, My People, the Old Woman Next Door, the Turf Basket, the Palm Oil, My Breeches, the Porpoises, the Wheat Ship, Myself and the Conger Eel. So he sets out what he's going to talk about in that episode, and Flann O'Brien adopts that in our text. He does the same thing at the beginning of his, at least in my edition. I think in most editions it starts that way. So our text for chapter 1 starts, Why I Speak, My Birth, My Mother and the Old Grey Fellow, Our House, the Glen where I was born, the hardships of the Gaels in former times. So what we have, Flann O'Brien is writing a pseudo-autobiography of a gentleman by the name of Bonaparte O'Cunasa, who, and I should mention that The Islandman is set in the Blasket Islands off the coast of Kerry, off the Dingle Peninsula. And it's written in a style of Gaelic and of a people of Gaelic speakers from an area called Corcaginia. It's hard to spell that in Irish, or I'd spell it for you. It's even harder to say it correctly in Irish, and I apologize if it's not correct. But as we see, Flann O'Brien sets Bonaparte O'Cunasa in an area called Corkadorky, which I think is just another one of his many jokes. But so with all that being said, I think and if you come across an Irish expression, maybe we can stop and I can give you hints or tips on how it's pronounced if that's of interest to you. But I think we've got the time to do that. But if not, let's just start. And I think I will start, if you don't mind.
Alrighty.
I am noting down the matters which are in this document because the next life is approaching me swiftly. Far from us be the evil thing, and may the bad spirit not regard me as a brother. And also because our likes will never be there again. It is right and fitting that some testimony of the diversions and adventures of our time should be provided for those who succeed us, because our types will never be there again, nor any other life in Ireland comparable to ours who exists no longer. O'Cunasa is my surname in Gaelic. My first name is Bonaparte, and Ireland is my little native land. I cannot truly remember either the day I was born or the first 6 months I spent here in the world. Doubtless, however, I was alive at that time, although I have no memory of it, because I should not exist now if I were not there then. And to the human being, as well as to every other living creature, sense comes gradually. The night before I was born, it happened that my father and Martin O'Banissa were sitting on top of the hen house, gazing at the sky to judge the weather, and also chatting honestly and quietly about the difficulties of life. "Well, now, Martin," said my father, "the wind is from the north, and there's a forbidding look about the White Bends. Before the morning, there'll be rain, and we'll get a dirty, tempestuous night of it that will knock a shake out of us, even if we're in the very bed. And look here, Martin, isn't it the bad sign that the ducks are in the nettles? Horror and misfortune will come on the world tonight. The evil thing and sea cat will be afoot in the darkness. And if 'tis true for me, no good destiny is ever in store for either of us again." "Well, indeed, Michelangelo," said Martin O'Banissa, "'tis no little thing you've said there now. And if you're right, you've told nary a lie but the truth itself. I was born in the middle of the night, in the end of the house. My father never expected me because he was a quiet fellow and did not understand very accurately the ways of life. My little bald skull so astounded him that he almost departed from this life the moment I entered it. And indeed, it was a misfortune and harmful thing for him that he did not, because after that night, he never had anything but misery and was destroyed and rent by the world and bereft of his health as long as he lived. The people said that my mother was not expecting me either. And it is a fact that the whisper went around that I was not born of my mother at all, but of another woman. All that, nevertheless, is only the neighbors' talk and cannot be checked now because the neighbors are all dead, and their likes will not be there again. I never laid eyes on my father until I was grown up, but that is another story, and I shall mention it at another time in this document. I was born in the west of Ireland on that awful winter's night. May we all be healthy and safe, in the place called Corcadorca, and in the townland Lisnabroshkeen.
Oh my gosh.
I was very young at the time I was born and had not aged even a single day. For half a year, I did not perceive anything about me and did not know one person from the other. Wisdom and understanding, nevertheless, come steadily, solidly, and stealthily into the mind of it. Somebody else, please.
Go ahead, Duncan.
All righty. Wisdom and understanding, nevertheless, come steadily, solidly, and stealthily into the mind of every human being. And I spent that year on the broad of my back, my eyes darting here and there at my environment. I noticed my mother in the house before me, a decent, hefty, big-boned woman, a silent, cross, big-breasted woman. She seldom spoke to me and often struck me when I screamed in the end of the house. The beating was of little use in stopping the tumult because the second tumult was worse than the first one. And if I received a further beating, the third tumult was worse than the second one. However, my mother was sensible, level-headed, and well-fed. Her like will not be there again. She spent her life cleaning out the house, sweeping cow dung and pig dung from in the front of the door, and churning butter and milking cows, weaving and carding wool and working the spinning wheel, praying, cursing, and setting big fires to boil a house full of potatoes to stave off the day of famine. There is another person in the house in front of me, an old, crooked, stooped fellow with a stick, half of whose face and all of whose chest were invisible because there was a wild, wool-gray beard blocking the view. The hairless part of his face was brown, tough, and wrinkled, like leather, and two sharp, shrewd eyes looked out from it at the world with a needle's sharpness. I never heard him called anything but the old gray fellow. He lived in our house, and very often my mother and he were not of the same mind, and bedad, It was an incredible thing, the amount of potatoes he consumed, the volume of speech which issued from him, and what little work he performed around the house. At first, in my youth, I thought he was my father. I remember sitting in his company one night, both of us gazing peacefully into the great red mass of the fire where my mother had placed a pot of potatoes as big as a barrel of boiling for the pigs. She herself was quiet in the end of the house. It happened that the heat of the fire was roasting me, and I was not able to walk at that time and had no means of escape from the heat on my own. The old gray fellow cocked an eye at me and announced, "'Tis hot, son." "There's an awful lot of heat in that fire, truly," I replied. "But look, sir, you called me son for the first time. It may be that you're my father and I'm your child. God bless and save us, and far from us be the evil thing." "'Tisn't true for you, Bonaparte," said he, "for I'm your grandfather. Your father is far from home at the present, but his name and his surname and his present habitation of Michelangelo Canassa." "And where is he?" "He's in the jug," said the old gray fellow. At that time, I was only about in the 10th month of my life. But when I had the opportunity, I looked into the jug. There was nothing in it but sour milk. It was a long time until I understood the old gray fellow's remark. But that is another story, and I shall mention it in another place in this document. Okay, Sheila.
There is another day of my youth which is clear in my memory and eminently describable. I was sitting on the floor of the house, still unable to walk or even stand, and watching my mother sweeping the house and settling the hearth neatly with the tongs. The old gray fellow came in from the field and stood looking at her until she had finished the work. "Woman," said he, "it is a harmful, untimely work that you're at there, and you may be sure that neither good nor fine instruction will come of it for the fellow who's there on his backside on the floor of our house. Any word and nearly every sound out of you are sweet to me," said she, "but truly I don't understand what you're saying." "Well," said the old fellow, "when I was a raw youngster growing up, I was, as is clear to any reader of the good Gaelic books, a child among the ashes. You have thrown all the ashes of the house back into the fire or swept them out in the yard, and not a bit left for the poor child on the floor." He pointed a finger toward me to let him into. "It's an unnatural and unregulated training and rearing he'll have without any experience of the ashes. Therefore, woman, it's disgraceful for you not to leave the hob full of dirt and ashes, just as the fire leaves it." "Very well," said my mother. "'Tis true for you, although you seldom talk a bit of sense, and I'll be glad to put back all I swept from the hob." And she did so. She took a bucket full of muck, mud, and ashes and hen's droppings from the roadside and spread it around the hearth, gladly in front of me. When everything was arranged, I moved over near the fire, and for 5 hours, I became a child in the ashes, a raw youngster rising up according to the old Gaelic tradition. Later at midnight, I was taken and put into bed, but the foul stench of the fireplace stayed with me for a week. It was a stale, putrid smell, and I do not think the like of it will ever be there again. Bill?
Bill, would you go into the ashes thing a little bit?
Well, what he's saying, I mean, that was an old expression. I was a child of the ashes, meaning that when I grew up as a child, I would, as he said, I would just sit in the hearth near the ashes or in the ashes, and that would, so the old man, the grandfather, thinks that's the only way a child should be raised in the old Gaelic tradition of being in the ashes. So, and his mother is not a very big fan of the old fellow, the old gray fellow, her father-in-law. So she caters to his whims, as it were, but comically. So she's not just left the ashes for the child to play in, but she's just grabbed all kinds of dirt and muck and everything she could and put it all around.
So she did it on purpose.
Fault.
Yeah, she did that on purpose.
I thought it was all mixed together and she couldn't separate it.
Well, there's that too, but she didn't bother to even try to separate it. She's just said, all right, here's your ashes.
Yeah.
We lived in a small, lime white, unhealthy house situated in a corner of the glen on the right-hand side as you go eastwards along the road. Doubtless, neither my father nor any of his people before him built the house and placed it there. It is not known whether it was God, demon, or person who first raised the half-rotten rough walls. If there were 100 corners in all that glen, there was a small lime-white cabin resting in each one, and no one knows who built any of them either. It has always been the destiny of the true Gales, if the books be credible, to live in a small lime-white house in the corner of the glen as you go eastwards along the road. And that must be the explanation, that when I reached this life, there was no good habitation for me, but the reverse in all truth. As well as the poverty of the house in itself, it clung to a lump of rock on the perilous shoulder of the glen, although there was a fine site available lower down. And if you went out the door without due care as to where you stepped, you could be in mortal danger immediately because of the steep gradient. Our house was undivided. Wisps of rushes above us on the roof, and rushes also as bedding in the end of the house. At sundown, rushes were spread over the whole floor, and the household lay to rest on them. Yonder a bed with pigs upon it, here a bed with people, a bed there with an aged slim cow stretched out asleep on her flank, and a gale of breath issuing from her capable of raising a tempest in the center of the house. Hens and chickens asleep in the shelter of her belly, another bed near the fire with me on it. Yes, people were in bad circumstances when I was young, and he who had stock and cattle possessed little room at night in his own house. Alas, it was always thus. I often heard the old gray fellow speak of the hardship and misery of life in former times. There was a time, said he, when I had 2 cows, a cart horse, a race horse, sheep, pigs, and other lesser animals. The house was narrow, and upon me soul, 'twas a tight, troublesome situation we were in when the night came. My grandfather slept with the cows, and I myself slept with the horse, Charlie, a quiet, gentle animal. The sheep used often start fighting, and many times I went without a wink of sleep from the bleating and the roaring they used to have. One night, my grandfather was hurt and wounded, but we didn't know whether he was the sheep or the cows that were the cause of it, or whether my grandmother herself started the quarrel. But another night, a gentleman arrived, a school inspector that went astray in the bog mist and happened to come on the mouth of the glen. Looking for help and lodging he was, maybe. And when he saw what was to be seen in the low light of the fire, he let a long roar of amazement out of him and stood there on the threshold staring in. Says he, isn't it a shameful, improper, and very bad thing for you to be stretched out with the brute beast, all of you stuck together in the one bed? And isn't it a shameful, bad, and improper state that you're in here tonight? 'Tis true for you, I replied to the gentleman, but sure we can't help the bad state you've mentioned. The weather is bitter, and every one of us must be inside from it, whether he has 2 legs or 4 under him. If that's the way it is, says the gentleman, wouldn't it be easy for you to put a little hut on the side of the yard, and it a bit out from the house? Sure, and 'twould be easy, says I. I was full of wonder at all he said, because I never thought of the like, nor any of other plan that would be handy to improve the bad state we were in, all of us stuck together in the end of the house. The next day I gathered the neighbors and explained exactly to them the gentleman's advice. They praised that advice, and within a week we had put up a fine hut adjacent to my house. But alas, things are not what they seem to be. When I, my grandmother, and 2 of my brothers had spent 2 nights in the hut, we were so cold and drenched wet that it's a wonder we did not die straight away, and we couldn't get any relief until we went back to the house and were comfortable again among the cattle. We've been that way ever since, just like every poor bit of a Gael in this side of the country. The old gray fellow often provided accounts such as this of the old times, and from him I received much of the sense and wisdom which is now mine. However, concerning the house where I was born, there was a fine view from it. It had 2 windows with a door between them. Looking out from the right-hand window, there below was the bare, hungry countryside of the Rosses and Gweedore, bloody Flann yonder, and Tory Island far away out, swimming like a great ship where the sky dips into the sea. Looking out of the door, you could see the west of County Galway with a good portion of the rocks of Connemara, Aaron Moor and the ocean out from you with the small, bright houses of Kilronan, clear and visible, if your eyesight were good and the summer had come. From the window on the left, you could see the great Blasket, bare and forbidding as a horrible otherworldly eel lying languidly on the wave tops. Over yonder was Dingle with its houses close together. It has always been said that there is no view from any house in Ireland comparable to this, and it must be admitted that this statement is true. I have never heard it said that there was any house as well situated as this on the face of the earth. And so this house was delightful. And I do not think that its like will ever be there again. At any rate, I was born there, and truly this cannot be stated concerning any other house, whether that fact be praise or blame. Next.
Okay. Chapter 2. A bad smell in the house. The pigs. The coming of Ambrose. The hard life. My mother in danger of death. Martin's plan. We are saved and are safe. The death of Ambrose. In my youth, we always had a bad smell in our house. Sometimes it was so bad that I asked my mother to send me to school, even though I could not walk correctly. Passers-by neither stopped nor even walked when in the vicinity of our house, but raced past the door and never ceased until they were half a mile from the bad smell. There was another house 200 yards down the road from us, and one day when our smell was extremely bad, the folks there cleared out, went to America, and never returned. It was stated that they told people in that place that Ireland was a fine country, but that the air was too strong there. Alas, there was never any air in our house. A member of our household was guilty of this stench. Ambrose was his name. That old fellow was very attached to him. Ambrose was Sarah's son. Sarah was a sow which we possessed, and when progeny was bestowed on her, it was bestowed plentifully. In spite of her numerous breasts, there was none for Ambrose when the piglets were suckling their nourishment from her. Ambrose was very shy, and when hunger struck the piglets, it strikes her psyche suddenly, and all at the same time. He was left at the end without a breast. When the old fellow realized that this little piglet was becoming feeble and losing his vigor, he brought him into the house, settled a bed of rushes for him by the fireside, and fed him from time to time with cow's milk out of an old bottle. Ambrose recovered without delay, grew strongly, and became fine and fat. But alas, God has permitted every creature to possess its own smell, and the pig's inherited aroma is not pleasant. When Ambrose was little, he had a little smell. When his size increased, his smell grew accordingly. When he was big, the smell was likewise big. At first, the situation was not that bad for us throughout the day, because we left all the windows open, the door unshut, and great gales of wind swept through the house. But when darkness fell, and Sarah came in with the piglets to sleep. That indeed was a situation which defies both oral and written description. Often, in the middle of the night, it seemed to us that we could never see the morning alive. My mother and the old fellow often arose and went out to walk 10 miles in the rain, trying to escape from the stench. After a month of Ambrose in our house, the horse, Charlie, refused to come in at night and was found every morning drenched and wet. There was never a night without a downpour upon us. But he was nevertheless in good humor despite all he had suffered from the inclemency of the weather. Indeed, it was I who bore the hardship without a doubt, because I couldn't walk nor find any means of self-locomotion. Matters continued thus for a little while. Ambrose was swelling rapidly, and the old gray fellow said that shortly he would be strong enough to be out in the air with the other pigs. He was the old fellow's pet, and that is why my mother could not drive out the unfragrant pig from the house by the cudgeling, although her health was failing due to the putrid stench. We noticed suddenly that Ambrose, all in one night, it seemed, had increased to a fearful size. He was as tall as his mother, but much wider. His belly reached the ground, and his flanks were so swollen that they would frighten you. One day, the old gray fellow was putting down a great large pot of potatoes for the pig's dinner when he noticed that all was neither good nor natural. "Upon me soul," said he, "this hen here is about to burst." When we scrutinized Ambrose sharply, it was evident that the poor creature was almost completely cylindrical. I do not know whether it was due to overeating or whether dropsy or some other fell disease struck him. I had not, however, narrated all. The smell was now almost insufferable for us, and my mother fainted in the end of the house, her health having failed due to this new stench. Sheila?
"If this pig is not put out of the house at once," said she, feebly, from the bed in the end of the house, "I'll set these rushes on fire, and then an end will be put to the hard life in this house of ours. And even if we finish up later in hell, I've never heard there are pigs there anyway." The old fellow was puffing at the pipe strenuously in an attempt to fill the house with smoke as a defense against the stench. He replied to her. "Woman," said he, "the poor creature is sick, and I'm slow to push him out, and he without his health. 'Tis true that this stench is beyond all, but don't you see that the pig himself is making no complaint, although he has a snout on him, just like yourself there? He's dumb from the stench," said I. "If that's the way it is," said my mother to the old fellow, "I'll put the rushes in flames." The two of them continued nagging at one another for a long while, but at last the old fellow agreed to eject Ambrose. He went forward, coaxing the pig to the door while whistling nonsensical talk and pet words, but the beast stayed as he was, unmoved. It must have been that the pig's senses were deadened by the smell, and they failed to hear all the old fellow had to say. At any rate, the old fellow took a cudgel and drove the pig to the door, lifting him, beating him, and pushing him with the weapon. When he reached the door, it appeared to us that he was too fat to go out between the jambs. He was released, and he returned to his fireside bed, where he fell asleep. "Upon my soul," said the old gray fellow, "but the creature is too well fed, and the doorway is too narrow, although there is room in it for the horse himself." "If that's the way it is," said my mother from the bed, "'tis that way, and it is hard to get away from what's in store for us." Her voice was weak and low, and I was certain she was now willing to bow to fate, to the rottenness of the pig, and to face heaven. But suddenly a smothering fire arose in the end of the house, my mother burning the place. Back went the old fellow in one leap, threw a couple of old sacks on the smoke, and beat them with a big stick until the fire was quenched. He then beat my mother and gave her beneficial advice while doing so. God bless us and save us. There was never as hard a life as that which Ambrose gave us for a fortnight after this. There is no describing the smell in our house. The pig was doubtlessly ill, and vapor arose from him reminiscent of a corpse, top to bottom, unburied for a month. The house was rotten and putrid from top to bottom as the result of him. During that time, my mother was in the end of the house, unable to stand or speak. At the end of the fortnight, she bade us adieu and goodbye quietly and feebly, and set her face toward eternity. The old fellow was in the bed, smoking his pipe energetically during the night as a shield against the stench. He leaped up and dragged my mother out to the roadside, just saving her from death that night, although both of them were drenched to the skin. The following day, the beds were put out by the road, and the old fellow said that there we would remain henceforth, because, said he, it is better to be without the house than life, and even if we are drowned in the rain at night, that death itself is better than the other one within. Bill?
Martin O'Bannister was going along the road that day, and when he saw the unfragrant breads outside beneath the sky in our deserted house, he stopped and struck up a conversation with the old fellow. "'Tis true that I don't understand life and the reason that the beds are outside, but look at the house on fire." The old fellow gazed at the house and shook his head. "That's no fire," said he, "but a rotten pig in our house. That's not smoke that's a drifting from the house, as you think, Martin, but pig steam." "That steam is not pleasing to me," said Martin. "There's no health in it," retorted the old fellow. Martin pondered the question for a while. "It must be the way," said he, "that this pig of yours is a pet and that you wouldn't want to cut his throat and bury him." "'Tis true indeed for you, Martin," said he. "If that's the way," said Martin, "I'll give ye help." He went up on the roof of the house and put straws of grass on the chimney opening. He then closed the door and blocked the windows with mud and rags to keep air from going in or coming out. "Now," said he, "we must be quiet for an hour." "On me soul," said the old gray fellow, "I don't understand this work, but it's a wonderful world that's here today. And if you're pleased with what you've done, I won't go against you." At the end of that hour, Martin O'Bannister opened the door and we all went in except my mother, who was still weak and feeble on the damp rushes. Ambrose was stretched cold and dead on the hearthstone. He had died of his own stench, and a black cloud of smoke almost smothered us. The old fellow was very sad, but gave heartfelt thanks to Martin and ceased puffing his pipe for the first time in 3 months. Ambrose was buried in an honorable and becoming manner, and we were all once more very well in that house. My mother recovered fast from her ill health and was once more energetic, boiling large pots of potatoes for the other pigs. Ambrose was an odd pig, and I do not think that his like will be there again. Good luck to him if he be alive in another world today. Next.
Okay, I have a question, Bill. And there may not be an answer. It may be so simple an answer, but they keep on referring to the end of the house over and over and over again. Does that just mean the far side of the house?
Bill, you're not.
You're muted, Bill.
In most Irish houses, you had the hearth on one end and the beds on the other end, and it was called the end of the house. The same word that is also used for your bottom or the end of you. So there are many puns in Irish about, and it's a question of whether you're talking about which end you're talking about, the end of the house or your ass. And there's a great deal of humorous expressions in Irish about all of that, but it's known as the tin. So the chin, T-I fada N is the fire, and the tan, T-E-A-N, I think it is the end. So the expression in Irish, there's no fire like your own fire, meaning there's no place like home. But with just a little change in pronunciation in Irish, you could say there's no ass like your own ass. And they say that too, just as a joke. But so that's the end of the house was where the sleeping is done. And it's the opposite end from the hearth. And I suppose that was probably out of safety. The house fire was not uncommon in those days. They were not, construction techniques were not, they were usually thatched roofs. Even though in Corcadorky, as they say, it rained every day of the year. So it's always raining in Corcadorky, and life was miserable there. I mean, it's as miserable as it gets anywhere in the world, according to Flann O'Brien, according to Bonaparte O'Cunasa, anyway.
There's no misery like our misery.
No misery like our misery, and the likes of which will not be seen again.
Yes.
But
okay.
And the custom was to keep livestock in the house with you, and it was both for the fact that they didn't really build pens or sties or things like that covered at all. Why, I don't know, but one reason is it made the house warmer to have the livestock inside with you. I mean, they were just basically stone walls with lime wash on them, mud covered and lime washed, so not very well insulated. So, and the fire was used mostly for cooking, and the flue was constructed to take all of the smoke out of the house. You didn't want the house filling with smoke. So consequently, it didn't throw a lot of heat into the house either. I mean, it was great for cooking, but not necessarily for heating. So having the animals in the house at night kept you warm.
Yeah, That was pretty much true almost anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
For a long, long time. Okay, shall we go on to chapter 3?
I was thinking about Ambrose feeding a pig cow's milk. Right. A baby pig is probably why he was so,
smelly. Yeah, he probably had horrible colic and gas and things from that. Who knows?
And
but it's also
never recovered.
The other aspect of it, normally, I mean, sows were raised for their young, for bannocks, for the baby pigs, which then you could sell at market. But one you would keep and raise, and then you would butcher, and that pig, I should say, not cow. But you'd butcher a pig every year and then hang the rafters with hams and various cured, smoked parts of the pig. But Ambrose, being a pet, they gave him a Christian burial, which is really bizarre. I mean, that in itself is just a ridiculous notion that you wouldn't have slaughtered the pig and made good use of it.
Yes, well, they gave him a name.
Yes, that's right.
The fatal farmer's mistake.
Right.
Well,
let the children name one of the animals that was supposed to be slaughtered.
The old man mothered him, it was like the old man's baby.
Well, he was the runt of the litter and would have died otherwise. So the old gray fellow took pity on him.
Yeah.
So I think.
All right.
Shall we do one more chapter?
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Go through chapter 3 and then maybe a bit of discussion, and then we'll wrap it up till next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 3. I go to school, Jams O'Donnell, the 2-pound grant, pigs again in our house, the old gray fellow's plan, one of our pigs missing, the shanty and the gramophone.
Shanachie.
I was
The
Shanachie.
Shanachie is a storyteller.
Yeah.
Shan is the Irish word for old. So old stories, old tales, and the person that tells the old tales is a Shanachie.
Shanachie. Okay. It's interesting. The CH is just like in Italian, it sounds like it becomes a K.
Yeah, but this is an anglicized Irish spelling. It wouldn't be spelled that way in Irish.
Okay. All right. I was 7 years old when I was sent to school. I was tough, small, and thin, wearing gray wool breeches, but otherwise unclothed above and below. Many other children besides me were going to school that morning with the stain of the ashes still on the breeches of many of them. Some of them were crawling along the road and able to walk. Many were from Dingle, some from Guidor. Another group floated in from Aran. All of us were strong and hearty on our first school day. Sod of turf was under the armpit of each of us. Hearty and strong were we. The master was named Osborne Lo Lunasa. He was dark, spare, and tall, and unhealthy with a sharp, sour look on face where the bones were protruding through the yellow skin. A ferocity of anger stood on his forehead, as permanent as his hair, and he cared not a whit for anyone. We all gathered into the schoolhouse, a small, unlovely hut. The rain ran down the walls and everything was soft and damp. We sat on benches without a word or sound for fear of the master. He cast his venomous eyes over the room and they alighted on me where they stopped. By Jove, I did not find his look pleasant while these two eyes were sifting me. After a while, he directed a long yellow finger at me and said, Fat Salam. I didn't understand what he said, nor any other type of speech which was practiced in foreign parts because I had only Gaelic as a mode of expression and as a protection against the difficulties of life. I could only stare at him, dumb with fear. I then saw a great fit of rage come over him and gradually increase exactly like a rain cloud. I looked around timidly at the other boys. I heard a whisper at my back. Your name he wants. My name leapt with joy at this. My heart leapt with joy at this assistance, and I was grateful to him who prompted me. I looked politely at the master and replied to him, Bonaparte, son of Michelangelo, son of Peter, son of Owen, son of Thomas's Sarah, granddaughter of John's Mary, granddaughter of James, son of Dermot. Before I had uttered or half uttered my name, a rabid bark issued from the master, and he beckoned to me with his finger. By the time I had reached him, he had an oar in his grasp. Anger had come over him in a flood tide at this stage, and he had the businesslike grip of the oar in his two hands. He drew it over his shoulder and brought it down hard on me with a swish of air, dealing me a destructive blow on the skull. I fainted from that blow, but before I became totally unconscious, I heard him scream. Your name, said he, is James O'Donnell. James O'Donnell? Those two words were singing in my ear when feeling returned to me. I found I was lying on my side on the floor, my breeches, hair, and all my person saturated with streams of blood which flowed from the split caused by the oar in my skull. When my eyes were in operation, there was another youngster on his feet being asked his name. It was apparent this child lacked shrewdness completely and had not drawn good beneficial lessons for himself from the beating which I had received, because he replied to the master, giving his common name as had I. The master again brandished the oar which was in his grasp, and did not cease until he was shedding blood plentifully, the youngster being left unconscious and stretched out on the floor, a bloodied bundle. And during the beating, the master screamed once more, "Your name is James O'Donnell." He continued in this master until every creature in the room had been struck by him, and all were named James O'Donnell. No young skull in the countryside that day remained unsplit. Of course, there were many unable to walk by the afternoon, were transported home by relatives. It was a pitiful thing for those who had to swim back to Erin that evening, and without a bite of food or a sup of milk since morning. Next, please.
When I myself reached home and my mother was there boiling potatoes for the pigs, and I asked her for a couple for lunch, I received them and ate them with only a little pinch of salt. The bad situation in the school was bothering me all this time, and I decided to question my mother. "Woman," said I, "I've heard that every fellow in this place is called James O'Donnell. If that's the way it is, it's a wonderful world we have, and isn't it? O'Donnell, the wonderful man, and the number of children he has. 'Tis true for you," said she. "If 'tis true itself," said I, "I've no understanding of that same truth." "If that's the way," said she, "don't you understand? Nice pictures in this book." So what page I'm at? 31. Skinny pages, huh? Maybe it says that Gales, I guess this is right, 31, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that Gales.
Okay, that Gales live in this side of the country and that they can't escape from fate. It was always said and written that every Gaelic youngster is hit on his first school day because he doesn't understand English and the foreign form of his name, and that no one has any respect for him because he's Gaelic to the marrow. There's no other business going on in school that day but punishment and revenge and the same fooling about James O'Donnell. Alas, I don't think that there'll ever be any good settlement for the Gales, but only hardship for them always. The old gray fellow was also hit one day of his life and called James O'Donnell as well. "Woman," said I, "what you say is amazing, and I don't think I'll ever go back to that school, but it's now the end of my learning." "You're shrewd," said she, "in your early youth." I had no other connection with education from that day onwards, and therefore my Gaelic skull has not been split since. But 7 years afterward, when I was 7 years older, it came to pass that wonderful things happened in our neighborhood, things connected with the question of learning, and for this reason I must present some little account of them here. The old fellow was one day in Dingle buying tobacco and tasting spirits when he heard news which amazed him. He did not believe it because he never trusted the people of the town. The next day he was selling herons in the Rosses and had the same news from them there. He then half accepted the story, but did not altogether swallow it. The third day he was in Galway City and the story was there likewise. At last he believed it believingly, and when he returned drenched and wet, the downpour comes heavily on us unfailingly each night. He informed my mother of the matter, and me also, who was eavesdropping in the end of the house. "Upon my soul," said he, "I hear that the English government is going to do great work for the good of the paupers here in this place. Safe and saved may everyone be in this house. It is fixed to pay the likes of us £2 a skull for every child of us that speaks English instead of this thieving Gaelic, trying to separate us from the Gaelic they are. Praise be to them, semper paternally. I don't think there'll ever be a good condition for the gals while having small houses in the corner of the glen, going about in the dirty ashes, constantly fishing in the constant storm, telling stories at night about the hardships and hard times of the Gaels in the sweet words of Gaelic. natural to them. Next.
Woe is me, exclaimed my mother, and I with only the one son. This dying example here that's on his backside over on the floor there. If that's the way, said the old fellow, you'll have more children or else you're without resource. During the following week, a staunch black gloom came over the old gray fellow, a portent that his mind was filled with difficult, complicated thoughts while he endeavored to solve the question of the want of children. One day, while in Cahershaveen, he heard that the new scheme was underway, that the good foreign money had been received already in many houses in that district, and that an inspector was going about through the countryside, counting the children and testing the quality of English they had. He also heard that this inspector was an aged, crippled man without good sight, and that he lacked enthusiasm for his work as well. The old fellow pondered all that he heard, and when he returned at night, drenched and wet, he informed us that there is no cow unmilkable, no hound unraceable, and also no money which cannot be stolen. Upon me soul, said he, we'll have the full of the house before morning, and every one of them turning 2 pounds for us. It's a wonderful world, said my mother, but I'm not expecting anything of that kind, and neither did I hear that a house could be filled in one night. Don't forget, said he, that Sarah is here. Sarah, indeed, said my startled mother. Amazement leaped up and down through me when I heard the mention of the sow's name. The same lady, exactly, said he. She has a great crowd of family at present, and they have vigorous voices, even though their dialect is unintelligible to us. How do we know but that their conversation isn't in English? Of course, youngsters and piglets have the same habits and take notice that there's a close likeness between their skins. You're reflective, replied my mother, but they must have suits of clothes made for them before the inspector comes to look at them. They must indeed, said the old gray fellow. It's a wonderful world these days, said I from the back bed at the end of the house. Upon me soul, but 'tis wonderful, said the old fellow. But in spite of the payment of the English money for the good of our likes, I don't think there'll ever be good conditions for the Gales. The following day, we had these particular residents within, each one wearing a gray wool clothing while squealing, rooting, grunting, and snoring in the rushes in the back of the house. A blind man would know of their presence from the stench there. Whatever the condition of the Gales was at that time, our own condition was not at all good, while these fellows were our constant company. We kept a good vigil for the inspector's arrival. We were obliged to wait quite a while for him, but as the old fellow said, whatever's coming will come. The inspector approached us on a rainy day when there was bad light everywhere and a heavy twilight at the end of our house where the pigs were. Whoever said that the inspector was old and feeble told the truth. He was English and had little health, poor fellow. He was thin, stooped, and sour-faced. He cared not a whit for the Gales, no wonder, and never had any desire to go into the cabins where they lived. When he came to us, he stopped at the threshold and peered short-sightedly into the house. He was startled when he noticed the smell we had, but did not depart because he had much experience of the habitations of the true Gales. The old gray fellow stood respectfully and politely near the door in front of the gentleman, I beside him, and my mother was in the back of the house, carrying and petting the piglets. Occasionally, a piglet jumped into the center of the floor and without delay returned to the twilight. One might have thought that he was a strong male youngster crawling through the house because of the breeches which he wore. A murmur of talk arose all this time from my mother and the piglets. It was difficult to understand because of the noise of wind and rain outside. The gentleman looked sharply about him, deriving but little pleasure from the stench. At last he spoke. How many? 12, sir, said the old gray fellow courteously. 12? The other man threw another quick glance at the back of the house while he considered and attempted to find some explanation for the speech he heard. All speak English? All speak, sir, said the old fellow. Then the gentleman noticed me standing behind the old gray fellow, and he spoke gruffly to me. What is your name? Said he. James O'Donnell, sir. It was apparent that neither I nor my like appealed to this elegant stranger, but this answer delighted him because he could now declare that he questioned the young folk and was answered in sweet English. The last of his labors was completed, and he might now escape freely from the stench. He departed amid the rain showers without word or blessing for us. The old gray fellow was well satisfied with what we had accomplished, and I had a fine meal of potatoes as a reward from him. The pigs were driven out, and we were all quiet and happy for the day. Some days afterwards, the old gray fellow received a yellow letter, and there was a big currency note within it. That is another story, and I shall narrate it at another time in this volume. Next.
When the inspector had gone and the pig's odor cleared from the house, it appeared to us that at the end of that work was done, and the termination of that course reached by us. But alas, things are not what they seem, and if a stone be cast, there is no foreknowledge of where it may land. On the following day, when we counted the pigs while divesting them of their breeches, we were missing one. Great was the lamentation of the old gray fellow when he noticed that both pig and suit of clothes had been snatched privily from him in the quiet of the night. It is true that he often stole a neighbor's pig, and he often stated that he never slaughtered one of his own, but sold them all, although we always had half sides of bacon in our house. Night and day there was constant thieving in progress in the parish, paupers impoverishing each other, but no one stole a pig except the old fellow. Of course, it was not joy which flooded his heart when he found another person playing his own tune. Upon my soul, said he to me, I'm afraid they're not all just and honest around here. I wouldn't mind about the little pig, but there was a fine bit of stuff in that breeches. Everyone to his own opinion, young man, said I, but I don't think that anyone took that pig or the breeches either. Do you think, said he, that fear would keep them from doing the stealing? No, I replied, but the stench would. I don't know, son, said he, but you're truly in the right. I don't know, but that pig is off rambling. It's an unfragrant rambling if it is true for you, my good man, said I. That night, the old man stole the pig from Martin O'Banassa and killed it quietly in the end of the house. It happened that the conversation had reminded him that our bacon was in short supply. No further discussion concerning the lost pig took place then. A new month, called March, was born, remained with us for a month, and then departed. At the end of that time, we heard a loud snorting one night in the height of the rain. The old fellow thought that yet another pig was being snatched from him by force and went out. When he returned, his companion consisted of none other than our missing pig, drenched and wet, the fine breeches about him in saturated rags. The creature seemed by his appearance to have trudged quite an area of the earth that night. My mother arose willingly when the old fellow stated it was necessary to prepare a large pot of potatoes for the one who had after all returned. The awakening of the household did not agree too well with Charlie, and having lain awake, looked furiously through during the talking and confusion. He suddenly arose and charged out in the rain. The poor creature never favored socializing much. God bless him. Next, please.
The return in darkness of the pig was amazing, but still more amazing was the news which he imparted to us when he had partaken of the potatoes, having been stripped of the breeches by the old gray fellow. The old fellow found a pipe with a good jot of tobacco in one pocket. In another, he found a shilling and a small bottle of spirits. Upon my soul, said he, if 'tis hardship, that's always in store for the Gales. It's not that way with this creature. Look, said he, directing his attention to the pig. Where did you get those articles, sir? The pig threw a sharp glance out of his two little eyes at the old fellow, but did not reply. Leave the breeches on him, said my mother. How do we know but that he'll be coming to us every week in wonderful, precious things in his pockets, pearls, necklaces, snuff, and maybe a money note. Wherever in Ireland he can get them. Isn't it a marvelous world today altogether? How do we know, said the old grave fellow in reply to her, that he will ever again return, but live where he can get these good things, and we'd be forever without the fine suit of clothes that he has. True for you, indeed, alas, said my mother. The pig was now stark naked and was put with the others. A full month went by before we received an explanation of the complicated matter of that night. The old fellow heard a whisper in Galway, half a word in Gweedore, and a phrase in Dunquin. He synthesized them all, and one afternoon, when the day was done and the nocturnal downpour was mightily upon us, he told us the following interesting story. There was a gentleman from Dublin traveling through the country who was extremely interested in Gaelic. The gentleman understood that in Corcadora, there were people alive who were unrivaled in any other region, and also that their likes would never be there again. He had an instrument called a gramophone, and this instrument was capable of memorizing all it heard if anyone narrated stories or old lore to it. It could also spew out all that it had heard whenever one desired it. It was a wonderful instrument and frightened many people in the area and struck others dumb. It is doubtful whether its like will ever be there again. Since folks thought that it was unlucky, the gentleman had a difficult task collecting the folklore tales from them. For that reason, he did not attempt to collect the folklore of our ancients and our ancestors, except under cover of darkness, when both he and the instrument were hidden in the end of a cabin and both of them listening intently. It was evident that he was a wealthy person because he spent much money on spirits every night to remove the shyness and disablement from the old people's tongues. He had that reputation throughout the countryside, and whenever it became known that he was visiting in Jimmy's or Jimmy Tim Pat's house, every old fellow who lived within a radius of 5 miles hastened there to seek tongue loosening from this fiery liquid medicine. It must be mentioned that many of the youths accompanied them. Want to go on, Bill?
On the night of which we speak, the gentleman was in the house of Maximilian Opinisa, quietly resting in the darkness and with the hearing machine by him. There were at least 100 old fellows gathered in around him, sitting dumb and invisible in the shadow of the walls and passing around the gentleman's bottles of spirits from one to the other. Sometimes a little spell of weak whispering was audible, but generally no sound except the roar of the water falling outside from the gloomy skies, just as if those on high were emptying buckets of that vile witness on the world. If the spirits loosened the men's tongues, it did not result in talk, but rather in rolling and tasting on their lips the bright drops of spirits. Time went by in that manner, and it was rather late in the night. As a result of both the heavy silence inside and the hum of the rain outside, the gentleman was becoming a little disheartened. He had not collected one of the gems of our ancients that night and had lost spirits to the value of £5 without result. Suddenly, he noticed a commotion at the doorway. Then, by the weak light of the fire, he saw the door being pushed in. It was never equipped with a bolt. And in came a poor old man, drenched and wet, drunk to the full of his skin and creeping instead of walking upright because of the drunkenness. The creature was lost without delay in the darkness of the house, but wherever he lay on the floor, the gentleman's heart leaped when he heard a great flow of talk issuing from that place. It really was rapid, complicated, stern speech. One might have thought that the old fellow was swearing drunkenly, but the gentleman did not tarry to understand it. He leaped up and set the machine near the one who was spewing out Gaelic. It appeared that the gentleman thought the Gaelic extremely difficult, and he was overjoyed that the machine was absorbing it. He understood that good Gaelic is difficult, but that the best Gaelic of all is well nigh unintelligible. After about an hour, the stream of talk ceased. The gentleman was pleased with the night's business. As a token of his gratitude, he put a white pipe, a jot of tobacco, and a little bottle of spirits in the old fellow's pocket, who was now in an inebriated slumber where he had fallen. Then the gentleman departed homewards in the rain with the machine, leaving them his blessing quietly. But no one responded to it because drunkenness had come in a flood tide now through the skull of every one of them who was present. It was said later in the area that the gentleman was highly praised for the lore which he had stored away in the hearing machine that night. He journeyed to Berlin, a city of Germany and Europe, and narrated all that the machine had heard in the presence of the most learned ones of the continent. These learned ones said that they never heard any fragment of Gaelic which was so good, so poetic, and so obscure as it, and that were sure there was no fear for Gaelic while the like was audible in Ireland. They bestowed fondly a fine academic degree on the gentleman, and something more interesting still, they appointed a small committee of their own members to make a detailed study of the language of the machine to determine whether any sense might be made of it. I do not know whether it was Gaelic or English or a strange, irregular dialect which was in the old speech which the gentleman collected from among us here in Corcadorphy, but it is certain that whatever word was uttered that night came from our rambling pig.
Wonderful.
This is quite the work here.
Yeah, I love this book.
It's a great. It's one of the. I think it's one of the great books. It's just so funny. It's just so humorous, and particularly if you know the, as I say, that the tradition that it's coming out of those biographies, and all of those biographies, they go on and on about how hard their life was and how little they had and how.
Mm-hmm.
And as Crowan says, the likes of which will not be seen again.
Right.
That nostalgia.
There's a lot of that. I don't know how things are in Cleveland, but there's a lot of that going on here in Austin, Texas, among the folks my age, where, you know, there's every day on Facebook, there's lots of discussions about the old days and
right.
how wonderful it was and how it's all being washed away by the barbarians who are flooding.
Democrats, right?
Huh?
The Democrats, right?
No. This is not political at all. These are the musicians and the artists,
right.
and the countercultural folks that were in Austin in the 60s.
In the 60s, before Austin City Limits and all of the the big commercialization of it. It was a great music town. Well, it still is, but it's different, as you say.
Yeah, it's different. You know, I mean, fortunately, there's a lot of really good musicians, and there's a lot of places you can go where it doesn't set you back. You know, you can go have a couple of beers and listen to 2 or 3 hours of music and dance a little bit, and you know, it's a good night. And that goes on, although it keeps on being shifted further and further south of town. But you know, it's interesting. This whole thing of trying to preserve the past because the likes will never come again, which is always true.
Sure.
The counterculture gang must be getting kind of old.
70s. Yep. You know, I was here in Austin in 1962 and was basically here for the next 10 years. And then apparently there was another thing that happened in the 70s and even in the 80s. But, you know, anyway, it's kind of fun. I've got also the thing, a group of people from where I was raised who are also getting a little long in the tooth, as they say. And, you know, they have a club and we're talking about the good old days before the tourism came to Aruba, all that. Mm. So it's fun.
Think about Dylan, times they are a-changing. He thought they were changing for good.
Yeah, that's.
But he learned. He kind of stayed aware of the counter, I think, to it, or something like that. He became a Jew for Jesus.
Yeah, for a while. Still,
you remember? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm changing the subject, so go ahead. I'm always changing the subject.
Well, Dylan always was very good at recreating himself.
Yeah.
And, you know, for whatever reason, he's always had a marvelous talent as a wordsmith and creating images. And, you know, and there are others. And, you know.
I think Flann O'Brien does a really good job of bashing the English too, and pointing out their stupidity and their evil ways, the colonial ways of not understanding the people that they rule, and forcing their own traditions and customs and language on them. I think it's so that getting their own back is a great thing.
This is like the schools the government provided for Indians. It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Apparently there are still such schools. Mm-hmm. I'm told, someone I know who lives in Oregon, there's a school like that near where they live, where Indian kids go, you know, kind of a boarding school, I guess.
It's been, I think it's been since about 94, maybe not quite, somewhere around the early 90s since I've been out that way, but there used to still be, like in Oregon and places, still signs on places, no Indians. I mean, this is long after the Civil Rights Act and desegregation, but still signs there. And yeah, I think still the Native American schools were still being run.
It's amazing. Talk about dark money. We're still in the dark ages. We haven't emerged yet. I wanted to change the subject. In Winnie the Pooh, doesn't Winnie get stuck? He eats too much honey and then he goes into Piglet's house or something, and then he can't get out the door, and he doesn't eat for a while until he gets skinny enough to escape. You remember that?
Yeah.
I was thinking of that when the pig, poor, what's his name, Mason,
Ambrose.
Ambrose was stuck inside the house. Probably.
Also appreciated the fact that Flann O'Brien was so keenly sensitive to people's ability to mess with bureaucrats of any kind. And that the bureaucrats are kind of like, you know, it's like the social worker who doesn't want to go into the house because they really don't like these people. They really
they don't want to get their pants. They don't want to get their pants dirty. They don't want to sit on any chair or stay too long because the air is not breathable. But they're happy to leave them in those conditions. They just have to come and record it every now and then.
Yep. It's very funny. It's really interesting that he was able to maintain Flann O'Brien was able to maintain his position as a government bureaucrat and be so aware of all the different levels involved.
Was he a bureaucrat for a long time?
His whole life. I mean, his working life was as a, I can't remember now what his title was, but he was in the civil service in some capacity, just as his father had been. So he was well educated and a government employee all of his life. But then he was making some money as a writer, as a journalist, writing a column under an assumed name, and then he wrote these novels under another assumed name, pen name.
Right. I think he kept his personal history hidden for quite some time.
Yeah.
Didn't he and Joyce, they were acquainted, maybe did he help Joyce in some way or anything?
No, I think the story goes that the last book that Joyce was reading when he died was by Flann O'Brien. It was the one we read last time. I can't remember now what it's called.
Swim Two Birds.
Yeah, it's Swim Two Birds. And Swim Two Birds was on the reading table in Joyce's bedroom, and it was the last book he was reading.
You probably enjoyed it. Did you ever make sense out of it when you were reading it?
At Swim Two Birds?
Yeah.
Well, I think as much sense as you can make out of it. I mean, it's mostly, I think, again, farce to be enjoyed as farce. I don't know that there's much. I think people spend too much time looking in Joyce for serious answers rather than just enjoying
silliness. A pair of comedians like Laurel and Hardy.
Right.
Should do that.
Yeah. There's really no destination. It's just the journey. That's just fun. It's just fun.
But when I tried to read it several times, unfortunately, Bart, if I had ever read that with my husband, I would have enjoyed it.
Right.
And that didn't happen. I'm sure it could be read in a way by comic, talent, that it would be hilarious.
I thought I probably would not have finished it on my own, but reading as a group, I found it to be fun. Not, still pretty opaque in many places, and he just jumps around on so many different levels so quickly. But I suspect now if I go back and I start reading it in small pieces and giving lots of time, between the pieces, I would probably enjoy it.
It makes me think about how talented a good comedian is. The really funny comedians could handle material like that, and you'd get it. You get the hilarity of it.
I think a lot of it has to do merely with style. I think O'Brien's using Joyce as his model for the parody. I mean, Joyce is opaque to begin with to many readers. It takes we've been reading Ulysses forever, and Finnegan's Wake on the other, even more so. And you keep reading it, and the more you do, the more you get out of it.
Absolutely.
But Flann O'Brien is taking that opacity and then parodying it, so it's even more opaque and difficult. And I don't know that there's much more beyond that. I think the basic story, the story of this young student who's trying to write a novel and trying to pass his degrees, but also is more interested in meeting his mates and drinking. I mean, that's a very simple and a very Joycean story in and of itself, kind of a portrait of the artist thing with Buck Mulligan and all those medical students and the like. And the uncle is hilarious that he lives with. The rest of it is the novel that he's writing. And then again, that's a parody of Joyce, I think, in terms of Ulysses. It's like writing a story of your life as you're living it. But at Swim Two Birds, the characters take on a life of their own. I mean, he has them living in a hotel, but he doesn't know, when he has to introduce a character, he doesn't know what to do with them. He just sort of leaves them in a room. And in the meantime, they get ideas of their own, and they don't want to be at his mercy. So they agree. They kidnap him and beat him up and take him all over the place. And it's only when the chambermaid burns the manuscript that he is free from their grasp. And you know, I don't think there's much more to it than that, but it's fun. It's fun to read.
Maybe I need a leader. Maybe I'll get a break sometime and be somewhere in a quiet place without all this of my house around me. You know, The Crock of Gold?
The Crock of Gold is a great book. James Stephens. I love that book.
I remember that being extremely funny.
I have that right over here. I can go grab it. It's one of my own.
Master's thesis was on Stephens. So I got to enjoy that book.
I suggested that's one of the books I suggested to Jack that we do, that maybe Crock of Gold would be a good one for us, and it would be a good one for everyone to read.
It's a very funny book.
It is really a very funny book. Okay. And James Stephens is the author that Joyce wanted to finish Finnegan's Wake if he hadn't finished it before he died. He thought James Stephens could finish it for him. So there's that as well. You can get
Bart's thesis from the thesis company if you want to read it.
Oh yeah, I would like to.
I might actually have an extra copy. I got copies of all of this for kids in the family, relatives.
Oh, so they could.
I don't think anyone has really taken the challenge yet. They have the books.
Well, there's hope. Maybe time, you know, maybe one of the younger kids will pick it up. Yeah, I'd love to see it. So the dissertation was on Crock of Gold or on Stephens in general?
On Stephens. It was on James Stephens, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to read it.
Trying to think of the name of it.
I'll look for it.
Yeah. Sheila, I actually creating a library in the probably vain hope that one of my grandchildren will be interested.
Let's hope, yeah. But you have to let go of the outcome. You just never know.
I know what an arrogant fellow I was when I was in my late teens and 20s.
Yeah, what is an adult?
You know, the pinnacle was my father. After I graduated from high school, he offered to pay for me to take a trip down the Amazon. This is in 1963.
Wow.
And I turned it down.
Oh.
I told him, no, I'd rather go back to Austin, Texas and hang out and go to summer school. And that, you know, I keep that as a touchstone of how arrogant I was, how just thoughtless and you know, did not know the value of things necessarily.
Well, that's you cannot put old heads on young shoulders, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, with children, just the very fact that he wanted you to,
right,
was a problem.
Yeah.
Well, he and I had conflict, shall we say.
You're very lucky when your kid actually agrees with you.
Yeah, well, I've often thought I would like, knowing the value of travel and the like, that my children would have done more of it when they had an opportunity to, when they were younger, before they settled down. But they were all about settling down and going, you know, whatever direction they're going. So they wouldn't be led by me at all. But and who am I? You know, so if it was me, if I could go back in time, I would travel more. But that's in retrospect.
And you never know what the future will bring.
No.
In terms of, you know, there could suddenly be a change either in them or in grandchildren or in, you know. So I just pursue my interest as best I can and collect materials. And, you know, if it's a grandchild, that's fine. If I just had to stumble across some young person who's, you know, got a bent like that, you know, someday I might just say, you know, I got this library.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's looking for a home.
Right.
Yeah. Cleveland State took all of Bart's books on drama. We had an enormous collection because he wrote about Yeats, Yeats's plays, and they were just opening their drama library, the drama department. So they got boxes and boxes of his books, and some of them were rare, but I never hear from them, thanks for the books or anything. I don't care. I wasn't going to read them. I'm glad somebody is reading them.
That's good.
I hope they get used. I've thought the same thing, what to do with my library, and I'm slowly selling off parts of it, but I've got a huge collection of Irish language material that I thought, well, that should go to an Irish studies program somewhere, maybe in Milwaukee or in Boston or something. But
yeah, there are websites around. Lately, I've had great luck with Nextdoor. I want something, I want to get rid of something. Someone pops up. It's really been very helpful. So there may be websites of that sort where you just say, I have a collection of this, and it's free. You pay for the shipping, you can have it.
Yeah, I should do that. One of the things I need to move, I've got the 35 millimeter slide collection of the art history department from Cleveland State. It's like close to 400,000 slides in cabinets that I'm just storing in a storage unit because I couldn't stand to see them just thrown out.
Yeah, they're valuable.
I assume that you're writing up inventories and letting the library communities know that these are available.
I'm trying. I'm doing a bit of that, trying to. But if you're ever, if you're looking for a book someday, just let me know. I probably have it, Duncan.
Okay.
I'd send it to you.
The most exciting news for me in a long time is that the University of Texas Library is opening up to me again.
Oh, good.
As a courtesy. Well, they have a thing in Texas. They have a thing called courtesy borrower and tech share, which means that I'm a member of my local library. I can get a tech share card, and that gives me I can go and get a University of Texas library card, and I can go into any of the libraries and check out most of the material. And usually what I'm after is so obscure, I can keep it for months or even years just by faithfully renewing them. And, that was shut down in the spring of 2020.
Yeah.
He said, no more of that. Return all your books and you can't come here. And now just last week, they said, okay, send us this information. We're going to update your card and you can start coming in again. That's very exciting.
Yeah,
it is. It's exciting.
I've spent an amazing amount of money in the last 2 years on buying books.
Yeah.
So.
But be careful. Not everyone going back to the libraries are masked or vaccinated. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, I'm a nervous Nelly.
Yeah, good.
I'm actually pretty careful. Other than that 2-month period before Delta came to town, and then I went out and caroused a little bit. And then the moment I saw Delta coming to town, I thought, okay, time to go home again.
Yeah.
So, but I found out today that